In 2016, scientists extracted ancient DNA from a 5,000-year-old woman buried near Belfast. What they found dismantled everything Ireland thought it knew about itself. I asked Grok to find the most consequential, overlooked discoveries in Irish genetic history, and it came back with something most people have never heard of. The dark-featured people of Western Ireland have been called the Black Irish for generations. Jet black hair, pale skin, eyes that look more Mediterranean than Atlantic. And for just as long, the explanation offered was a romantic one. Spanish sailors, a shipwrecked armada, strangers who washed ashore and stayed. Geneticists have now proven that story is a complete myth. What the DNA actually reveals is something far older and far more extraordinary. Those dark features are not foreign. They are the oldest inheritance on this island. And what that means for Irish identity changes everything we thought we understood. The story most people know goes like this. The year is 1588. The Spanish Armada, 130 warships, 30,000 men, the most powerful naval fleet ever assembled, sets sail to invade England and fails. A combination of English firepower, catastrophic weather, and strategic incompetence scatters the fleet across the North Atlantic. 26 ships are driven off course and wrecked on the jagged coastline of Western Ireland. And that, the legend says, is where the Black Irish begin. Spanish sailors, dark-eyed, olive-skinned, dark-haired, crawled ashore on Irish beaches. They found shelter with Irish families. They stayed. They married. They fathered children. And their descendants, those striking dark-featured people in Connemara and Clare and Donegal, are their living legacy. It is a beautiful story. It is a romantic story. Every family that ever told it felt connected to the drama and tragedy of one of history's great naval disasters. There is just one problem. It is not true, not even close. Here is what the historical record actually shows. Of the roughly 6,000 Spanish sailors who wrecked on the Irish coast in 1588, the majority never made it ashore alive. The storms that destroyed their ships did not stop at the waterline. Men in full armor, weakened by weeks at sea, drowned in the surf by the hundreds before they ever touched Irish soil. Those who did make it ashore fared little better. At Streedag Strand in County Sligo, over 1,100 men washed up from 3 ships alone. A Spanish officer, Captain de Cuellar, survived and left a written account. He described watching his comrades robbed and left to die by locals who had no use for the men themselves, only their valuables. The few who escaped into the hills were hunted. English Governor Sir William Fitzwilliam issued a standing order. Any Spaniard found alive in Ireland was to be executed immediately. One English commander, Richard Bingham, boasted of personally killing more than 300 Armada survivors. The Irish chieftains who might have offered shelter faced impossible choices. Harboring soldiers who were enemies of the English crown meant risking the destruction of their own clans, their land, their lives. Most handed the survivors over. The very few who escaped Ireland eventually made their way to Scotland, then France, then home to Spain. Historians estimate that no more than a few hundred Armada survivors spent any meaningful time on Irish soil. Almost none stayed permanently. There are no Spanish surnames in Irish birth records from the late 16th century. Geneticist Dan Bradley of Trinity College Dublin stated it plainly. The Armada theory is a myth. A 2015 landmark study of British and Irish genetics led by Walter Bodmer at Oxford found at most a trace of ancient Iberian contribution to Irish DNA, and it predates the Armada by thousands of years. So if Spanish sailors did not make the Black Irish dark, what did? To answer that, we have to go back much further than 1588. Much further than anyone expects. The year is approximately 10,000 BC. The last ice age is retreating. For the first time in millennia, Ireland is habitable, and the first humans to arrive were not the ancestors of anyone we would recognize as stereotypically Irish today. They were hunter-gatherer nomads moving along the Atlantic coastline, following game, fishing rivers, gathering what a post-glacial landscape could offer. Their physical appearance would have surprised you. In 2016, scientists at Trinity College Dublin succeeded in sequencing the first ancient human genomes from Ireland. One of them belonged to a Neolithic woman buried approximately 5,000 years ago near Belfast. She has since been called the Ballinahaddy woman. Her genetic profile told a story nobody anticipated. She had black hair, she had brown eyes, and her closest modern genetic relatives were not in Ireland. They were not in Britain. They were in the Near East. She descended from a wave of Stone Age farmers who left the Fertile Crescent region around 6,000 years ago, spread gradually westward across Europe, and arrived in Ireland carrying agriculture, the tradition of building megalithic monuments, and critically, their pigmentation genes. Dark hair, dark eyes, features that had nothing to do with Spain and everything to do with the migration that predated the pyramids. This is the oldest layer. Dark features were present in Ireland before Stonehenge existed, before any written record anywhere in Europe. The Ballinahaddy woman was buried with those features on this island 3,000 years before the Spanish Armada was even a concept. Then around 2500 BC, everything changed again. A new migration swept into Ireland from the eastern steppes of Europe, from what is now Ukraine and southern Russia. These were the Yamnaya-related peoples, moving west across the continent in a wave that fundamentally reshaped the genetics of the entire Atlantic world. They brought cattle, they brought bronze, they brought the Proto-Celtic languages that would eventually become Irish, Welsh, and Scottish Gaelic. And they brought lighter features, a tendency toward fair hair and blue eyes, along with a genetic marker called haplogroup R1b. Today, Ireland has the highest concentration of R1b in the world. Over 80% of Irish men carry it. The second highest concentration is not in neighboring Britain or France. It is in the Basque country of northern Spain and the broader Iberian Peninsula. These two populations, the Irish and the Iberians, share a deep genetic kinship that predates Julius Caesar, predates written history entirely. It is the fingerprint of the Atlantic Bronze Age, a shared maritime culture stretching along the entire Atlantic coast of Europe from Portugal to Ireland, trading metal, exchanging people, building common traditions across thousands of miles of open water. That is the real Irish-Spanish connection, not shipwrecked soldiers on a Sligo beach in 1580. A blood bond forged 4,000 years ago, but the layering did not stop there. And what came next explains something that has puzzled people for generations. The Vikings arrived in Ireland in 795 AD. They came first as raiders, hitting the monasteries on the coast, taking what they could carry and leaving before any organized resistance could form. Then they stayed. They built settlements. They intermarried with Irish families across generations and left their genetic signatures behind. Approximately 20% of Irish men in certain regions carry detectable Viking ancestry in their Y chromosomes today. The raiders became neighbors. The neighbors became family. The Normans followed in 1169. French-speaking descendants of Norse settlers carrying their own genetic blend from northern France, they arrived not as raiders but as conquerors with administrative ambitions. They built castles, established towns, and embedded themselves into Irish political life in ways that proved far more durable than anyone at the time expected. Surnames like Fitzgerald, Burke, and Power carry Norman blood to this day. 1,000 years later, the genetic contribution is still legible. English colonization from the 1500s onward brought successive waves of settlers from across Britain, carrying the full genetic diversity of an island already shaped by its own layered migrations from continental Europe. Each wave added something. Each wave changed the population in ways that accumulated over centuries into the complex genetic landscape that modern analysis can now read with considerable precision. But here's the pattern that matters. Every one of those waves landed predominantly on the east and the south. The Normans settled the east coast and the Midlands. The Vikings established their cities, Dublin, Waterford, Cork, Limerick, on the eastern and southern seaboards. English plantation concentrated in Ulster and Munster. The West was always the last place reached, the most resistant, the most isolated from the forces continuously reshaping everywhere else. And then Cromwell made the isolation permanent. In the 1650s, dispossessed Irish Catholics were given a choice that passed into history in 4 words: to hell or to Connaught. He sent them to the most barren, rocky, remote corner of the island, land so poor that an English administrator famously observed it had neither water enough to drown a man, nor tree enough to hang one, nor soil enough to bury one. Paradoxically, that brutal exile preserved something. The people pushed to Connaught, already among the most Gaelic, most ancient, most genetically original of the island's inhabitants, were isolated further. Their genetic diversity narrowed. Their oldest features persisted in concentrations that the more accessible parts of Ireland had long since diluted. This is why the Black Irish are most concentrated in the west. County Galway, County Clare, County Mayo, Connemara, the Aran Islands. The Atlantic coast held the oldest blood because geography and then deliberate exile made it the hardest place to reach and the easiest place for outside settlement to overlook. What looks like an anomaly on the west coast of Ireland is not an anomaly. It is preservation. But the term used to describe these people did not come from Ireland at all. It came from America, and it was born in hatred. The phrase Black Irish did not originate in the west of Ireland. It did not emerge from Connemara fishing villages or Clare hillside communities or any of the places where the dark-featured people it would come to describe had lived for generations. Professor Mary Burke of the University of Connecticut spent years researching the phrase and its origins. Her conclusion is striking. Black Irish first appeared in American records as early as the 1830s. It exploded into common usage in the 1840s. The timing is not a coincidence. That is the decade of the Great Famine. Between 1845 and 1852, the potato blight destroyed Ireland's food supply with a thoroughness that is still difficult to fully absorb. 1 million people died. Another 2 million fled, most of them to the United States. They arrived in Boston and New York and Philadelphia malnourished, traumatized, Catholic in a society whose Protestant establishment viewed their faith as something between a foreign infection and a moral failing. They spoke Gaelic or English with accents that marked them immediately. They competed for the lowest wages on the worst jobs available in the fastest-growing cities in the world. They were not welcome. The nativist Know-Nothing movement declared them racially inferior with a confidence that required no evidence because evidence was never the point. Signs reading "No Irish Need Apply" appeared in shop windows across American cities. Newspapers ran cartoons depicting Irish immigrants as subhuman, drawing them with exaggerated simian features designed to place them outside the boundaries of whiteness that American society was constructing with increasing rigidity in the years before the Civil War. The know-nothing sentiment fueled hostility. It was in this atmosphere of organized contempt that Black Irish became a weapon. It was deployed specifically to separate the newly arrived desperate famine Irish from the earlier, more respectable pre-famine Irish Americans who had already begun to assimilate into the social fabric. Black Irish implied inferiority. It implied not quite white. It was used to block social advancement, to justify exclusion, to mark an entire category of people as other in a society that had decided otherness was disqualifying. Some Irish Americans turned the phrase in a different direction, using it to explain away African American ancestry in families attempting to pass in white society. A term invented to wound became a tool for concealment, and then, over generations of distance from its origins, something stranger still. F. Scott Fitzgerald used it in his writing, giving it a brooding, romantic quality. Robert E. Howard wrote Black Irish characters as dark, passionate, wild-spirited. The phrase accumulated mythology, the way phrases do when the people who use them have forgotten what the people who invented them intended. An insult became an identity. A weapon became a badge. A label designed to exclude became a source of pride claimed by millions of Irish Americans who knew they carried something that did not fit the standard story. The mythology buried the truth. And the truth, when genetics finally produced it, turned out to be more remarkable than any of the myths. Strip away the Armada legend. Strip away the American slur and the romantic mythology that grew over it. Strip away every story that was ever told about where the dark features came from and why they persisted. What remains is the genetic record. And the genetic record does not tell stories for social purposes. It records what happened in base pairs and haplogroup distributions and pigmentation gene variants that accumulated across hundreds of generations without asking anyone's permission. What it records about the Black Irish is this. The dark features are not an anomaly in the Irish genetic story. They are the story. They represent the survival of the oldest genetic threads on the island. Threads that stretch back before agriculture, before metalworking, before any written record anywhere in Europe, to the very first humans who walked on Irish soil after the ice retreated. Consider what the red hair actually is. The feature that became the global shorthand for Irishness, the detail that every outsider reaches for when describing the Irish, is largely Viking in origin. It arrived with raiders from Scandinavia approximately 1,100 years ago. It is, in the deep genetic timeline of Ireland, a recent addition. The fair complexion that looks stereotypically Irish to the outside world came predominantly with the Bronze Age steppe migrants, the Yamnaya-related peoples who arrived only 4,000 years ago. Recent, by the standards of what was already on the island when they got there, but the jet black hair, the dark eyes, the skin that tans rather than burns, that goes back 10,000 years. It connects directly to the Ballinahatti woman and her Near Eastern farming ancestors who arrived in Ireland before the pyramids existed and left their genetic signature in the Western populations where outside settlement never fully reached. Population genetics studies consistently show the Western Irish as genetically distinct from the Eastern Irish in ways that map precisely onto the historical patterns of settlement and isolation. The West retained the pre-Bronze Age genetic signature, the Neolithic farmer layer from the Near East, in higher concentrations than anywhere else on the island. The faces in Connemara today carry a genome shaped more by the world of 3000 BC than by anything the Vikings or Normans or English planters brought with them afterward. When you look at a Black Irish face, that quality of being somehow both ancient and vivid, what you are looking at is 10,000 years of continuous presence on one island. Genetics that survived every conquest, every plantation, every famine, every diaspora, intact enough to still be readable in a cheekbone and a hair color in the 21st century. The Armada story implied the dark features were foreign. The American slur implied the same thing in crueler language. Both agreed on the same underlying premise. Darkness in an Irish face meant something from outside. Genetics has answered that premise. The dark features are not the foreign element in the Irish story. They are the oldest element, and what that means extends far beyond hair color or eye color. The Black Irish mystery was never really about physical appearance. It was always about belonging, about who gets to be called truly Irish, about the stories that people tell themselves when they need an identity to hold on to, and the stories told about them by others who need a category to exclude them with. The dark features were a surface. The argument underneath was always about authenticity, about origin, about who arrived first and who arrived as a stranger. The Armada legend was appealing precisely because it answered that argument with romance. It gave dark-featured Irish people something cinematic to point to. A dramatic origin moment, shipwrecked soldiers, survival against impossible odds, a story with the texture of history even if the history was invented. People do not hold on to myths because they are lazy or credulous. They hold on to them because the myths are doing something useful. The Armada story was useful because it made dark features explicable without making them threatening to anyone's sense of what Irish was supposed to look like. The American slur worked the opposite way. It used the same physical reality, the same dark hair and dark eyes, and turned it into a mechanism of exclusion. Both the romantic myth and the organized contempt agreed on the same premise. Dark features in an Irish face required an explanation from outside. They were a deviation from a norm that needed accounting for. What genetics has produced is not a refinement of that premise. It is a demolition of it. The norm was never what anyone thought it was. The stereotypically Irish appearance, fair skin, red hair, light eyes, is itself a layered accumulation of migrations that arrived after the oldest inhabitants were already established. The most recent major contribution to that appearance came from Scandinavian raiders 1,100 years ago. The feature that every outsider reaches for when they picture an Irish face is, in the deep timeline of the island, practically new. The dark features go back twice as far as recorded Irish history, 3 times as far as the Viking raids. They connect to a population that was farming the Irish landscape and building megalithic monuments before any of the peoples whose migrations define the conventional Irish genetic story had set foot on the island. If you have those features, if someone in your family was called Black Irish as a compliment or as an insult or as something in between, the genetics is unambiguous about what you are carrying. Not foreign blood, not the legacy of a shipwreck, not an anomaly requiring explanation. The oldest blood on the island. A genetic inheritance so ancient it predates the concept of Ireland itself. The people who told most insistently that their darkness was foreign turned out, by every measure modern genetics can apply, to carry the deepest roots. The longest continuous presence. The most unbroken thread connecting the Ireland of today to the island as it was when the first humans found it emerging from the ice. That is not a footnote to the Irish story. That is its oldest chapter. When I gave this material to Grok and asked what it meant, it returned something worth sitting with. The answer to a mystery about dark hair and pale skin turned out to be an answer about time itself. About what survives when empires rise and fall and plantations reshape a landscape and famines empty entire counties. About the difference between what a culture decides to call authentic and what genetics quietly records without asking for permission. The Ballinahady woman was buried near Belfast 5,000 years ago with black hair and brown eyes. The faces on the west coast of Ireland today carry her genome. That continuity survived everything, every conquest, every label, every story told by people who needed the dark features to mean something foreign. They never did. They meant something original. The Black Irish are not a mystery descended from a shipwreck. They are a mystery descended from time itself.